Ethan Caldwell had it all: wealth, power, a future carved in stone. But when he chose love over legacy, his world crumbled. Cut off, abandoned, and left with nothing, he fought to rebuild from the ground up. With Zara by his side, he turned loss into strength, proving that success isn't about privilege, it's about resilience. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge, inspire, and redefine what it means to win. Ethan Caldwell had always been destined for greatness. From the moment he took his first breath, his path had been laid out with meticulous precision, paved with wealth, privilege, and the unyielding expectations of his family. His father, Charles Caldwell, was a real estate mogul whose name carried weight in every boardroom and political circle across the city. His mother, Eleanor, was the epitome of high society, a woman whose every movement was calculated to maintain the family's pristine reputation. For as long as Ethan could remember, his life had been structured, dictated by unspoken rules passed down through generations. He had attended the most prestigious private schools, studied at an Ivy League university, and graduated at the top of his class, not because he had chosen to, but because there had never been another option. He had been trained in the art of negotiation before he could legally drink, coached in power and control with the precision of a chess grandmaster. Every decision had been made for him, every move carefully orchestrated to ensure that one day he would inherit the empire his father had built from the ground up. To the outside world, Ethan was the golden son, the heir to a dynasty, a man who had everything. But beneath the surface, he was a prisoner of expectations he had never agreed to. He moved through life on autopilot, fulfilling obligations not out of passion but out of duty. He knew his role, played his part, and never once stepped out of line, not because he feared rebellion, but because it was easier to comply than to fight. His engagement to Victoria Langley had been no different. The daughter of one of his father's oldest business partners, Victoria was everything a Caldwell wife was supposed to be: poised, intelligent, and impeccably bred for a life in high society. Their relationship was not born from love, but from strategy. A carefully curated alliance that would strengthen both families. Their engagement had been announced at an elaborate gala, a spectacle designed to solidify the power they represented together. Ethan had stood beside her, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands with men who saw him as nothing more than the next generation of Caldwell dominance. And yet, even as he played his part, something inside him remained hollow. He had never once questioned the life laid out before him, never once dared to wonder what might exist beyond the carefully curated walls of his world. Until the night that changed everything. It had been an event like any other, another high society gathering filled with men in tailored suits and women dripping in diamonds, discussing investments and mergers as though they were merely exchanging pleasantries. Ethan had attended out of obligation, making his rounds, shaking hands, nodding in all the right places. It was a game he had mastered long ago. But then he had seen her. She had been standing at the edge of the room, speaking with a passion that drew eyes despite the fact that most of the guests had no interest in what she was saying. She was animated, unfiltered, completely unaware, or perhaps completely indifferent, to the fact that her words did not belong in a room like this. Zara Bennett. He didn't know her, had never seen her before, and yet something about her held him captive. She was not polished in the way the women in his world were. She did not wear a designer gown, did not move with the carefully rehearsed grace of someone who had spent a lifetime being sculpted by etiquette instructors. She was striking, not in an artificial manufactured way, but in the way that came from authenticity. And she was arguing. Ethan had paused, watching as she debated a man twice her age, completely unafraid, unwavering in her stance. It took him a moment to realize what they were discussing: real estate policies, zoning laws, and the gentrification of lower-income neighborhoods. She spoke with conviction, exposing flaws in the system, flaws that, ironically, were the very foundation of his father's empire. Something about the way she spoke, the fire in her voice, the unwavering determination in her eyes, made Ethan realize he had never seen anyone so unapologetically alive. She did not cater to the room, did not soften her words to accommodate the fragile egos of the wealthy men surrounding her. She spoke because she believed in what she was saying, because she refused to be silenced. And for the first time in his life, Ethan found himself captivated by something, or rather, someone, who had nothing to do with his father's empire. He approached her without thinking, drawn to her in a way he could not explain. When she turned to him, there was no flicker of recognition in her eyes, no moment of realization that he was Ethan Caldwell, the heir to a billion-dollar dynasty. To her, he was just another man in a suit, another nameless figure in a sea of wealth and influence. "Do you always argue with strangers at events like this?" he asked, amusement lacing his tone. She arched a brow, unimpressed. "Only when they're wrong." He chuckled, intrigued. "And was he—" She nodded, her gaze steady. "Completely." He had expected her to ask who he was, to fish for details, to do what most people did when they met him, calculate how his existence could benefit them. But she did none of that. Instead, she looked at him the way one might look at a puzzle, as though she was trying to figure out why he was speaking to her at all. "You don't belong here," she said suddenly. Ethan blinked, startled. "Excuse me?" She tilted her head, studying him. "You look like you do. You play the part well. But you're not really here." He should have laughed, should have dismissed her words as nonsense. But he didn't. Because for the first time in his life, someone had looked past the facade. He spent the rest of the evening talking to her, drawn in by her candor, by the way she didn't filter her thoughts to suit the expectations of those around her. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, and by the time the night ended, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wanted to see her again. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of the penthouse apartment his father had gifted him, he felt something foreign settle in his chest. Doubt. For the first time, he questioned the life he had spent years following without hesitation. And deep down, in a place he had never dared to acknowledge, a quiet voice whispered a terrifying possibility. Maybe he didn't want the life that had been chosen for him. Maybe, for the first time, he wanted to choose for himself. Ethan had never pursued anything in his life that hadn't already been decided for him. Every step, every success, every relationship had been mapped out long before he had a say in the matter. But after that night, after that conversation with Zara Bennett, he found himself restless in a way he couldn't explain. It was as if she had cracked open a door he hadn't even realized was there, allowing him to glimpse something beyond the carefully controlled world he had always known. For days, he couldn't get her out of his mind. It wasn't just the way she spoke, the fire in her words, or the way she looked at him like he was a question that needed answering. It was the way she had made him feel. He had never been spoken to like that before, never been regarded without the weight of his last name hanging in the air. She had seen something in him, something he wasn't sure he even recognized in himself, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. A week later, he found himself walking into a quiet coffee shop in a neighborhood he had never set foot in before. It was smaller than the sleek, modern cafes he was used to, filled with the hum of quiet conversations and the scent of freshly brewed coffee. It wasn't his world, and yet, when he spotted her sitting in the corner, typing furiously on her laptop, he felt something strange settle inside him, a sense of certainty. She didn't notice him at first. Her focus was entirely on whatever she was working on, her brows furrowed, her fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he was making a mistake, if this was just some reckless impulse he would later regret. But then she looked up, her gaze locking onto his, and for the first time in his life, Ethan acted on instinct instead of expectation. "Are you stalking me?" she asked, arching a brow as he approached her table. He smirked. "I like to think of it as strategic coincidence." She let out a short laugh, shaking her head as she closed her laptop. "Let me guess. You tracked me down through some ridiculous network of rich people connections." He slid into the seat across from her, unbothered by the skepticism in her tone. "I asked around," he admitted. "Turns out, you're not as difficult to find as you think." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether she should be impressed or annoyed. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "And why, exactly, did you want to find me, Ethan Caldwell?" Hearing his name from her lips sent a strange thrill through him. Most people said it with reverence, with expectation. She said it like it didn't matter, like he was just another man sitting across from her, and for some reason, that made him want to know her even more. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about what you said," he admitted, surprising even himself with his honesty. "You told me I don't belong in that world, and I think you might be right." She tilted her head, her gaze unreadable. "And what do you want me to do with that information?" He hesitated, then exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know yet." Zara watched him for a long moment, then shook her head with a small, knowing smile. "You're a puzzle, Caldwell, and I don't do puzzles." But despite her words, she didn't ask him to leave. Instead, she called the barista over, ordered another coffee, and slid it across the table toward him. And just like that, a door he hadn't even known he wanted to open was suddenly wide open. Their conversations turned into something he hadn't expected. What had started as chance encounters soon became deliberate. He sought her out, not because he needed something from her, not because she was part of some greater plan for his future, but because he wanted to. She fascinated him in a way no one ever had. She was sharp, unfiltered, and unapologetic. She challenged him in ways no one else dared. Most people in his life spoke in careful, curated words, always aware of what could be gained or lost with every conversation. Zara didn't operate that way. She spoke her mind without hesitation, called him out when he was being blind to the realities of the world beyond his bubble, and never once treated him like he was special. She didn't fit into his world, and yet she was slowly becoming the only part of it that felt real. One night, they ended up walking along the riverfront after an impromptu dinner that had lasted hours longer than either of them had planned. The city lights reflected off the water, casting golden ripples across the dark surface. The air was cool, the streets alive with the quiet hum of people moving through the night. "Tell me something," she said, glancing at him as they strolled side by side. "Do you actually like your life?" He hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "You have everything, money, power, influence, but every time you talk about your future, you sound trapped." He exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. He had never said the words out loud. had never allowed himself to truly acknowledge the quiet resentment that had been festering inside him for years. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I've never really thought about it." She stopped walking, turning to face him. "That's not an answer." He met her gaze, something stirring deep inside him. "No," he said finally. "I guess it's not." She studied him for a long moment before shaking her head with a soft laugh. "You really are a puzzle." Something about the way she looked at him made him want to be better, to figure out what he actually wanted instead of what had always been expected of him. And then, before he could stop himself, he asked the question that had been haunting him for days. "Would it be so bad?" he asked. She frowned slightly. "Would what be so bad?" "If I didn't want the life that's been handed to me. If I wanted something else." Zara's expression softened, the sharpness in her gaze replaced by something gentler. "No," she said quietly. "It wouldn't be bad at all. But the question is, are you willing to fight for it?" He didn't answer right away, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he had the courage to. That night, as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, he realized something. He had always been a man who knew exactly where he was going, exactly what came next. But now, for the first time, he had no idea. And strangely enough, he didn't hate it. Ethan had never known what it felt like to truly make a choice for himself. Until now. It started as something small, something unspoken. The way he began prioritizing moments with Zara over the obligations that had once defined his existence. The way he found himself craving conversations with her more than the carefully measured discussions with business executives and family associates. It wasn't just the excitement of someone new. It was the way she made him feel like a man instead of a legacy, a person instead of an heir. But in his world, change was never small. It was never unspoken. It was noticed, dissected, and inevitably confronted. The whispers started first, his absence from the usual high society gatherings, the way he no longer attended charity galas with Victoria by his side, the fact that he was spending his time with a woman who did not come from their world, none of it went unnoticed. His mother's tight-lipped stares at family dinners grew colder. His father's disapproving glances sharpened into something far more dangerous, calculation. And then his friends began to react. "You're kidding, right?" Ethan sat across from Grayson Holt, a lifelong friend, a man who had been at his side since childhood. The two of them had been raised together, their futures intertwined by the expectations of their fathers. They had attended the same schools, shared the same social circles, understood the unspoken rules of their world. So it wasn't surprising that Grayson reacted the way he did when Ethan finally admitted the truth. "You seen her?" Grayson scoffed, swirling the whiskey in his glass before taking a slow sip. "You're actually serious about this?" Ethan leaned back against the booth of the private lounge they had frequented for years, feeling strangely detached from a place that had once felt so familiar. "I am." Grayson let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Jesus, this isn't just some phase?" Ethan's jaw tensed. "No." The laughter faded, replaced by something harder. "Ethan, do you have any idea what you're doing?" For the first time in a long time, Ethan's voice was steady when he answered. "Yeah, I do." Grayson studied him, his expression unreadable for a long moment before finally sighing. "Look, man, I get it. You want to play rebel for a little while, push back against the whole golden boy routine. But you and I both know this isn't sustainable. Ethan's hands curled into fists beneath the table. He had expected this, he had prepared for it. And yet, hearing it spoken aloud still sent a slow burn through his chest. "Why?" Ethan asked, his voice dangerously calm. Grayson gave him a look as if the answer was obvious. "Because you have a role to play. Because this," he gestured vaguely, "isn't what your life is supposed to be." Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling something in him settle. There it was, the truth he had always known but had never wanted to face. His world did not care about love. It did not care about happiness. It cared about power, about control, about maintaining an empire that had been meticulously built over generations. And Zara did not fit into that equation. But for the first time, Ethan didn't care. "She's not a phase," he said, standing from the table. Grayson stared up at him, something sharp in his gaze. "Then you better be ready for what happens next." Ethan didn't answer. He already knew. The war at home began that evening. His father was waiting for him in his study, the room steeped in silence, the heavy scent of old leather and expensive scotch hanging in the air. Charles Caldwell did not look up as Ethan entered, simply swirling the amber liquid in his glass, his movements slow and deliberate. Ethan stood still, waiting. When his father finally spoke, his voice was measured, deceptively calm. "Sit down." Ethan didn't move. "I'd rather stand." A flicker of something passed through his father's eyes, before he exhaled and set his glass down with a quiet clink. "I assume you know why we're having this conversation." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Because I'm not following the script?" Charles studied him, his expression unreadable. "Because you're making a mistake." There it was. Ethan let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "That's funny. I don't feel like I am." His father's lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time, something cold passed between them. "You think this is about feelings?" Charles said, his tone sharper now. "You think this is about love?" He leaned forward slightly, his piercing gaze locking onto Ethan's. "This is about the family, about the empire I built, about the legacy you are meant to uphold." Ethan met his father's stare head-on, his voice steady. "I never asked for that legacy." The silence that followed was deafening. His father's expression didn't change, but the shift in the air was palpable. Charles Caldwell had always been a man who measured his words, who never raised his voice unless absolutely necessary. His power did not come from loud threats or reckless displays of authority. It came from control, and right now Ethan could feel that control beginning to fracture. His father sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Do you understand what you're risking?" Ethan swallowed, but his voice didn't waver. "Yes." Charles nodded as if he had expected that answer. Then, with quiet finality, he said, "If you continue down this path, you are no longer my son." The words should have gutted him, should have shattered something deep inside. But instead, Ethan felt strangely calm, because he had already made his choice. He turned without another word, walking toward the door. And for the first time in his life, he did not look back. That night, Ethan found himself at Zara's apartment, standing in the dimly lit hallway outside her door. He had barely knocked before she pulled it open, her gaze immediately scanning his face, reading everything he wasn't saying. She didn't ask. Instead, she simply stepped aside, letting him in. The moment the door closed behind him, Ethan exhaled, the weight of everything settling onto his shoulders. Zara watched him, waiting. Then, in a voice softer than he had ever heard from her, she asked, "Are you okay?" He let out a breathless laugh, raking a hand through his hair. "No, not really." She didn't try to fix it, didn't offer meaningless reassurances. Instead, she reached for him, fingers tangling with his. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Ethan realized something. He had lost everything. His name, his future, his family. And yet, standing there, with Zara's steady presence anchoring him, he had never felt more free. Ethan had always believed that wealth was a constant, an unshakable foundation beneath his feet. He had never questioned it because he had never needed to. Money had been like air, always there, always available. Until now. The fallout from his decision was swift, brutal, and entirely expected. The day after he walked out of his father's office, his bank accounts were frozen. The sleek penthouse he had lived in for years, no longer his. The car he drove, gone. His family didn't just cut him off, they erased him. Within 24 hours, it was as if Ethan Caldwell had ceased to exist in their world. He had anticipated it, had told himself it wouldn't matter. But then the reality set in. He sat in the leasing office of his building, listening as a manager he had never bothered to learn the name of explained in polite, clipped tones that his residence had been revoked. No argument, no warning, just a cold, calculated removal. "I don't suppose you'll give me a few extra days?" he asked dryly, leaning back in the chair. The manager offered a rehearsed, almost sympathetic smile. "I'm afraid not, Mr. Caldwell. Your father was very clear." Of course he was. Ethan left the office with nothing but a duffel bag of clothes and a bitter taste in his mouth. He had known his father would retaliate, had expected consequences, and yet, standing on the sidewalk with no place to go, no safety net to fall into, the weight of it hit him in a way he hadn't been prepared for. He had never had to struggle before, never had to think about where he would sleep, how he would pay rent, or whether his credit card would work. Now, every privilege he had once taken for granted had been stripped away, and he was alone. Except he wasn't. Zara opened the door to her apartment with a look that said she had already guessed why he was here. "They cut you off," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "Completely." She sighed, stepping aside. "Come in." Ethan hesitated for half a second before walking inside. He had never needed to rely on anyone before, had never asked for help, never been in a position where he had to, but pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Zara's apartment was small, modest, nothing like the sprawling spaces he was used to. The walls were covered in framed newspaper clippings, her desk cluttered with notebooks and half-empty coffee cups. It was lived in, personal. Everything his world had never been. She crossed her arms, studying him. "You can stay here for now." Ethan met her gaze. "Are you sure?" She arched a brow. "Do you have any other options?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "No." "Then, yeah, I'm sure." And just like that, he had a place to stay. But finding a place to sleep was the easy part. Surviving? That was another story entirely. Ethan's first real dose of reality came the following week. With his family name now a liability instead of an asset, the job market was unforgiving. He sat through rejection after rejection, his resume once an automatic pass to the top of the pile, now dismissed the moment hiring managers realized he was no longer backed by the Caldwell empire. It wasn't just that his father had cut him off, it was that the entire industry had taken notice. The same men who had once toasted to his future now ignored his calls, unwilling to risk offending his father by offering him a chance. It was humbling, infuriating, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be powerless. "Welcome to the real world," Zara had said when he came home after yet another fruitless interview. He scowled, tossing his tie onto the couch. "The real world sucks," she smirked. "You'll get used to it." He took what he could get. Day labor, warehouse shifts, anything that paid enough to cover food and rent. It was exhausting, mind-numbing work, the kind of labor he had never imagined himself doing. His hands, once used only for signing contracts and shaking hands with the elite, were now calloused and sore from lifting crates and hauling supplies. He didn't complain, not out loud at least, but Zara saw it. One night he came home late, his body aching from hours of physical labor. He collapsed onto the couch, rubbing at his temples, exhaling slowly. Zara set down her laptop and stood, walking over to him. She didn't say anything, just disappeared into the kitchen before returning with a glass of whiskey. He glanced up, lips twitching. "You know, I never took you for the type to keep whiskey around." She shrugged. "You looked like you needed it." He took the glass, tipping it toward her in thanks before taking a sip. The burn was familiar, comforting in a way he hadn't expected. For a long moment they sat in silence. Then Zara spoke, her voice quiet. "Do you regret it?" Ethan looked at her. Did he? His body ached. His future was uncertain. He had lost everything. His wealth, his reputation, his family. But as he sat there, in the warmth of an apartment that actually felt like home, with a woman who saw him for more than his last name. "No," he said finally. "I don't." Zara studied him, as if searching for any sign of hesitation, but there was none. Then she smiled, just slightly. "Good." But hardship had a way of testing even the strongest resolve. A month in, money became an issue. Ethan refused to let Zara carry the burden alone, but jobs that paid in cash barely covered their expenses. His credit was shot, his old contacts were useless, and despite his best efforts, the weight of survival pressed down on him like a vice. One evening, as he sat at the small kitchen table, sorting through bills, Zara leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "We'll figure it out," she said. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." He ran a hand down his face, exhaling. "I've never had to struggle like this before." Zara walked over, sitting across from him. "And yet, here you are." "Surviving." He met her gaze. She believed in him. Even when he wasn't sure, he believed in himself. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a thought formed. A seed of an idea. Something that had been buried beneath the weight of his downfall. His father had built an empire off the backs of people who had no choice but to struggle. But Ethan had something his father never did. Perspective. He turned onto his side, watching as Zara slept, her breathing steady, her presence a grounding force. And for the first time since his world had crumbled, he felt something close to hope. Because maybe, just maybe, he could build something new, something real, something that belonged to him. Ethan had spent his entire life learning how to build businesses, how to negotiate deals, how to expand an empire. But none of those lessons had prepared him for starting from nothing. The idea had been simmering in the back of his mind for weeks. It started as a whisper, a distant thought he couldn't quite grasp. But then, one night, as he watched Zara sketch designs at the kitchen table, her fingers moving with a quiet determination, everything clicked into place. What if we build something together? She looked up, blinking in surprise. Build what? A business, he said, the words forming faster than he could fully process them. Something real. Something that matters. Zara set down her pencil, studying him. Go on, Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair as the idea took shape in his mind. You've always talked about how businesses should be doing more. About sustainability. About ethical design. What if we created something that combined both of our skills? A firm that focuses on sustainable architecture, interior design, product development, something that actually makes a difference. He raised an eyebrow. You realize we have no money, no investors, and no credibility, right? He leaned forward. I know business. I know how to scale something from nothing. And you, he gestured at her sketches, you have the vision. We don't need investors to start. We need a plan. Zara was silent for a long moment, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. Then, slowly, a smile tugged at the corner of her lips. You really think we can pull this off? Ethan met her gaze, his voice steady. I do. And just like that, Nova Haven was born. The first few weeks were brutal. They worked from the cramped kitchen table in their tiny apartment, using what little savings they had left to register the business and buy a domain name. Ethan spent hours reaching out to old contacts, most of whom ignored him entirely. Rejection became their new normal. Emails went unanswered, calls were politely declined. The people who had once considered Ethan an asset now saw him as a liability. I knew this would be hard, he muttered one evening, tossing his phone onto the table after yet another rejection. But I didn't think it would be impossible. Zara, who was sketching ideas for a potential project that didn't even exist yet, glanced up. You're used to people saying yes to you. He let out a dry laugh. Yeah, I guess I am. She smirked. Welcome to my world. Still, they didn't give up. They refined their pitch, built a portfolio out of nothing, designed mock-ups to showcase what they could do. Zara took on freelance design projects to bring in whatever income she could, while Ethan worked odd jobs to keep them afloat. It was exhausting, but it was theirs. Their first break came unexpectedly. A small, eco-conscious cafe in the city was looking to redesign its interior. The owner, a woman named Celeste, had seen one of Zara's freelance designs online and agreed to meet with them. Ethan and Zara spent the night before the meeting going over every detail, preparing for every possible question. The next morning, they sat across from Celeste in a tiny back room of the cafe, presenting their vision. Zara led the creative pitch, her voice steady as she explained how every material, every element of the design was chosen with sustainability in mind. Ethan handled the business side, negotiating terms, ensuring they could deliver without stretching themselves too thin. By the end of the meeting, Celeste was nodding slowly, a thoughtful expression on her face. I like you two, she said finally. You're scrappy. You remind me of myself when I was starting out. Ethan held his breath as she leaned back, tapping her fingers against the table. All right, she said. Let's do it. Zara blanked. Really? Celeste grinned. Really? They walked out of that meeting with their first client. It wasn't a massive deal. It wouldn't make them rich. But it was something. A start. They threw themselves into the project with everything they had. They spent late nights sketching designs, sourcing materials, figuring out ways to bring Zara's vision to life without exceeding their minuscule budget. Ethan negotiated every deal, every contract, using every skill he had learned in his old life to ensure they didn't fall apart before they even began. The work was relentless. But when the cafe finally reopened with their designs in place, the response was overwhelming. Customers noticed. Word spread. And suddenly, other small businesses began reaching out. Nova Haven was no longer just an idea. It was real. But success, as they quickly learned, came with its own set of challenges. The more projects they took on, the more the cracks began to show. They were working non-stop, stretching themselves thin just to keep up with demand. Money was still tight. Every dollar they made went straight back into the business. And then, one evening, Zara snapped. "I can't keep doing this," she said, slamming her laptop shut. Ethan, who had been reviewing contracts, looked up. "Doing what?" "This," she gestured wildly. "Running ourselves into the ground. We need help." He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "We can't afford to hire anyone yet." "We can't afford not to," she shot back. "We're drowning, Ethan." She was right. So they took a risk. They hired their first employee, a young designer named Jamie, fresh out of school, passionate and eager to learn. It was a gamble, but one that paid off. With Jamie's help, they expanded. They took on bigger projects. Their reputation grew. And for the first time, Ethan began to believe that they might actually make it. Months passed, and Nova Haven transformed from a struggling startup into something real, something people took seriously. They were featured in a local design magazine. Then another. Investors started to take notice. Clients who had once ignored Ethan now sought him out. And then, one evening, his phone buzzed with a message he never expected to see. From an unknown number. "I saw the article. Impressive work. Let's talk." Was glad. Ethan stared at the screen, his heartbeat picking up. He knew exactly who it was. His father. For a long moment, he just stood there, the weight of everything settling over him. Zara, who was sitting on the couch sketching, noticed his expression. "What is it?" she asked. He exhaled, holding up his phone. She read the message, then met his gaze. "Well, that didn't take long." Ethan let out a humorless laugh. "No, it didn't." She studied him carefully. "What are you going to do?" He didn't answer right away. Because for the first time since this had all started, he wasn't sure. He had fought so hard to escape his father's shadow. And now, just as he was finally standing on his own, the past had come knocking. Ethan stared at the message for a long time, the words burning into his mind like a brand. "I saw the article. Impressive work. Let's talk. See. He could hear his father's voice in those clipped, carefully measured words. Not an apology, not an admission of regret. Just a simple acknowledgement that Ethan had managed to build something that could no longer be ignored. For years, his father had dictated every step of his life, had shaped him into the perfect heir, the golden son meant to inherit an empire. And when Ethan had walked away, Charles Caldwell hadn't just disowned him, he had erased him. Cut him off so completely that for a while, Ethan had wondered if he had ever truly existed outside of his father's shadow. But now that same man was reaching out. Ethan's fingers hovered over his phone, torn between throwing it across the room and responding. "Are you going to answer him?" Zan's voice was calm, but he could hear the tension beneath it. He looked up, meeting her gaze. She was sitting across from him on their worn-out couch, sketchbook resting on her lap, her pencil still poised, as if frozen mid-stroke. He let out a slow breath. "I don't know." Zara studied him for a long moment before setting her pencil down. "He doesn't get to rewrite the past just because you're finally winning." "I know," Ethan muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. But did he? Because a part of him, the part that had spent his entire life chasing his father's approval, felt the weight of that message like a hook buried deep in his chest. It had always been about this, hadn't it? Proving that he could do it on his own. That he could build something without the Caldwell name, without his father's power. And now that he had, Charles Caldwell had decided to acknowledge him again. A test, a game, a move on the chessboard Ethan had walked away from. "You don't have to respond," Zara said, voice gentler now. But Ethan already knew he would. Not because he wanted to be pulled back in, but because he needed to see what his father wanted. They met 3 days later. A high-rise office building, floor-to-ceiling windows, a city stretched out below them like a kingdom waiting to be claimed. Charles Caldwell had always known how to orchestrate power. Ethan stepped into the conference room, his father already waiting for him, seated at the long table, as if this were just another business deal. His father looked older, though Ethan wasn't sure if that was reality or just his own shift in perspective. There was more gray at his temples, deeper lines around his mouth, but his presence hadn't diminished. He was still Charles Caldwell. Unshakable, Ethan sat across from him, stretching out in the chair like he wasn't feeling the weight of the moment, like he hadn't spent years wondering what this conversation would look like. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then his father leaned back slightly. "Nova Haven." Ethan arched a brow. "You've heard of it?" His father's mouth tilted in something that wasn't quite a smile. "People are talking." Ethan waited. He wasn't going to make this easy for him. Charles exhaled, tapping his fingers lightly against the table. "I underestimated you." It should have felt like a victory, like the acknowledgement Ethan had wanted for so long. Instead, it felt like a calculated maneuver. "I didn't come here for your approval," Ethan said, his voice even. His father nodded, as if he had expected that. "I imagine you came to see what I want." Ethan didn't answer. Charles steepled his fingers, watching him. "You built something impressive, Ethan, but if you want it to last, you're going to need resources. Real resources." Ethan let out a sharp laugh. "Let me guess. You're offering to invest." His father didn't flinch. "I'm offering an opportunity." Ethan's jaw tightened. "An opportunity for who?" Charles didn't blink. "For both of us." And there it was. The trap. The carefully laid out plan, dressed up as an olive branch. His father didn't just want to acknowledge Nova Haven. He wanted a stake in it. A way to pull Ethan back in, to tether him once more to the empire he had spent years trying to escape. And for the first time in his life, Ethan saw it for exactly what it was. Not a bridge. A leash. He stood slowly, placing his hands flat on the table, leaning in slightly. "You don't get to erase me and then decide I'm worth something again when it benefits you." His father's expression didn't change. "The world runs on strategy, Ethan, not sentiment." Ethan shook his head. "No, that's how your world runs." He straightened, buttoning his jacket. "I built this without you, without your money, without your name, without your influence." His voice didn't waver. "And I'm gonna keep it that way." His father exhaled slowly, as if considering his next move. "You think you're free of me?" Ethan held his gaze. "I know I am." He turned and walked away without another word. That night, Ethan sat on the rooftop of their apartment building, the city stretching out before him, the air crisp against his skin. Zara found him there, 2 beers in hand, settling beside him. "So," she said, handing him one, "how did it go?" Ethan exhaled, twisting the cap off. "Exactly how I expected." She smirked. "So he tried to pull you back in?" Ethan let out a dry chuckle. "Of course." Zara was quiet for a moment, then nudged his shoulder lightly. "And?" Ethan took a sip of his beer, staring out over the skyline. And for the first time he realized he wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't desperate for validation. He was just... And God help. What thanks? He turned to look at Zara, a slow smile forming. "And I told him to go to hell." Her eyes widened slightly, then she burst out laughing. "You did not." "Oh, I absolutely did." Zara grinned, clinking her bottle against his. "About damn time." Ethan laughed, shaking his head. For years he had believed that proving himself to his father was the end goal, that success would mean nothing unless Charles Caldwell recognized it. But sitting there, in a city he had built something real in, beside a woman who had never once doubted him, he realized that proving himself had never been about his father. It had always been about himself. And now he finally believed it. The invitation arrived on thick, embossed paper, the kind that reeked of wealth and exclusivity. The gold lettering glinted under the apartment's dim lighting, and Ethan felt the weight of it before he even read the words. The Caldwell Foundation Annual Charity Gala. It was his father's event. The same event Ethan had attended every year of his life until he walked away. Until he had become the disappointment, the exile. But now, for the first time in years, they wanted him back. He turned the invitation over, as if expecting to find a hidden message scrawled across the back, something that would make it clear what this really was. Because it wasn't about charity. It wasn't about mending bridges. This was about optics, about power, about his father wanting to remind the world that, no matter how far Ethan had come, he still bore the Caldwell name. Zara walked in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "That looks expensive," she noted, nodding at the invitation in his hand. Ethan exhaled, tossing it onto the coffee table. "It's a gala." Her eyes flickered with understanding. "Your father's?" "Yeah." Zara studied him for a moment. "You gonna go?" Ethan leaned back against the couch, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know. It's not an invitation. It's a spectacle." She smirked. "Then crash the damn thing." Ethan arched a brow. She shrugged. "They expect you to come back on their terms, show up on yours." The night of the gala, the city glowed beneath the crisp winter air, skyscrapers piercing the inky darkness with golden light. Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket as he stepped out of the car. Zara beside him in a sleek, midnight-shoed dress that shimmered under the streetlights. She looked powerful, unapologetic, and the moment they stepped inside, heads turned. It wasn't just curiosity. It was calculation. Ethan felt the shift in the room like a tangible force. The whispers, the glances, the subtle tightening of jaws from men who had once dismissed him. He met Zara's gaze, amusement dancing in her eyes. "They didn't expect me to bring you," he murmured. She smirked. "Then they should have been smarter." His mother was the first to approach, moving through the crowd with the kind of grace that had been drilled into her since birth. She was dressed in soft silver, diamonds at her throat, her expression carefully neutral. "Ethan," she said smoothly, "you came. You invited me," he replied. Her eyes flickered to Zara, something unreadable passing through them. "And you brought a guest." Zara extended her hand before Ethan could speak. "Zara Bennett." Her voice was cool, polite, but firm. His mother hesitated for half a second before taking it. "Eleanor Caldwell." The exchange was brief, but electric. His mother turned back to him, her smile thin. "Your father is expecting you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm sure he is." Charles Caldwell stood near the stage, surrounded by men who wielded power like a weapon, their conversations hushed but sharp. When Ethan approached, the group parted just slightly, as if instinctively making space for the confrontation they all knew was coming. His father looked up, his expression unreadable. "Ethan." Ethan met his gaze evenly. "Dad." A pause. Then his father gestured to the room around them. "You've done well. For yourself." Ethan didn't flinch. "Yeah, I have." His father studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. "So, what do you want from this?" Ethan tilted his head. "Nothing." His father's jaw twitched. "You've always been stubborn." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "No, Dad, I've always been my own person. You just never wanted to see it." Silence stretched between them. The men around them pretended not to listen, but Ethan could feel their attention like a weight in the air. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Out on the balcony, the city stretched out before them, the hum of the gala fading into a distant murmur. Zara leaned against the railing, looking out over the skyline. "You okay?" Ethan exhaled, the cold air clearing the last remnants of tension from his chest. "Yeah, I think I am." She glanced at him. "You walked away." He nodded. "For the last time." She studied him for a moment, then smirked. "You know what this means, right?" Ethan raised a brow. She leaned in slightly. "It means you won't." And as he looked out over the city, the one he had built something real in, something his own, he realized she was right. He had won. On his terms. The city stretched out before them, a skyline of ambition and consequence. From the balcony of their apartment, Ethan watched the lights flicker in the distance, each one a reminder of how far he had come. How far they had come. Behind him, Zara sat curled on the couch, a cup of tea resting between her hands, her sketchbook open beside her. She was always working, always thinking, her mind constantly shaping something new. It was one of the things he loved most about her, the way she poured herself into everything she did. He turned from the railing and walked toward her, settling onto the couch beside her. She glanced up, a soft smile playing at her lips. "You're thinking," she noted, setting her tea down. Ethan smirked. "Dangerous, I know." She nudged him playfully, but there was curiosity in her eyes. "Tell me." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "We built something incredible, Zara. But I I don't want to stop here. She arched a brow. You're talking about Nova Haven? He nodded. I don't just want it to be another successful firm. I want it to mean something. I want to change the way people think about design, about sustainability, about the spaces we live in. She studied him for a long moment, then leaned back against the cushions. That sounds like something we can do. Ethan looked at her, the woman who had stood beside him through everything. The rejection, the loss, the rebuilding. The woman who had never once doubted him. I don't want to do it without you, he admitted. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. You never have. And she was right. Their journey had started with nothing but a shared vision and the determination to make it a reality. They had faced rejection, doubt, and loss, but through it all, they had stood side by side. Now, standing on the edge of something even greater, Ethan knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And that was all that mattered. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. Stories like Ethan and Zara's remind us that life isn't about following a script written by others. It's about writing your own. This is a story of resilience, of breaking free from expectations, and of choosing passion over privilege. It teaches us that true success isn't measured by wealth or status, but by the courage to stand for what you believe in, even when the world tries to pull you back into the mold it created for you. Ethan walked away from everything he was told to be and built something real. Not for approval, not for validation, but for himself. And in doing so, he found not just success, but freedom. What about you? Have you ever had to make a choice that changed everything? Let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what did this story mean to you? If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and move you. Hit that notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. Because sometimes, the best stories are the ones that remind us of who we are meant to be.